Hello and welcome. This is Cheryl. I'm so glad you're joining me today. In this video, I'm going to show you how to make this Shadowbox pop-up card as well as the envelope to go with it. So there's a lot of different die cuts that I've used to create the scene, and you notice the acetate pieces that I took out. That's just to help those die cuts from catching on each other as it lays flat to fit into an envelope. This is the main die that I'm going to be using for the base, but rather than just using the dies in the kit, I also use these additional dies because why use one when you can use 5? When you go to create your card base, you want to make sure that you're choosing cardstock that's really thick and heavy and can support the weight of it. I'm using Neenah Classic Crest cardstock. It's a cover weight. You can also get Neenah in an index weight, but it's really quite flimsy and it wouldn't hold up to all the die cuts and stand on its own as a card. So definitely choose something that's heavier, thicker, and can support the weight of your card. From the Shadowbox Die Set, I'm going to be using the pieces just to make the base, as well as the small hill piece. So you're going to need the piece for the top and the bottom, and that's what I'm pulling right there. I'm using the small hill, and that's to attach some of the die cuts to include in the scene. And then I'm using the piece for the back of the card, as well as the frame to create the front window of the card. I'm using my Big Shot machine to cut it out. I'm using the piece for the back of the card first so it doesn't have the window frame in it. And I'm going to cut it out and pull out all the pieces from the intricate top to that piece. Before you take your cardstock out of the die, take a look at the back of it and make sure that all the pieces have cut through. If it hasn't cut through, just put it back through your machine again, or tighten the sandwich by using a shim underneath your bottom plate. Before we cut the piece for the front, we want to make sure to take all those little cardstock bits out of the die so that we get a clean cut for the front. Now we'll cut that piece again, but this time we've put in the window so that we're going to get an opening in the front of the card. This piece that's cut out from the window is big enough that I'll typically use it to cut other pieces out of. Now I'm cutting the small hill. I'm going to need 2 of them, and I'm using the scrap pieces from our front and back die cut pieces. The last piece to cut out for our Shadowbox card base is the top and the bottom. So this piece here, once again, we're going to cut 2. Now that our card base pieces are cut, I'm going to set those aside and work on the elements for the inside of the card. So the first one is the mountains. I've got my dies on the corresponding pieces that I want to cut. I'm going to die cut them, layer them, and I just follow the front of the card or front of the die envelope to know exactly what to layer where. And then once they are all glued together, I'll put a little bit of Stickles on the top just to highlight the top of the snow and then set them aside. The next layer to cut is the tree layer. So I'm going to cut a medium shade of green as well as a white in the trees. No need to take a lot of the pieces out of the bottom because they're hidden by the element that's right in front of it. You can if you want, but it's just not necessary. Once again, check your die cut before trying to take the cardstock out and make sure that everything has cut through. Otherwise, you're going to be a little bit aggravated trying to get the pieces apart. The pieces are really, really jagged, so they like to catch on each other, so it's a little bit challenging, but just knowing that it's cut all the way through makes it a little bit easier. Now I'm going to take one of the small hills and we're going to glue the trees to them. So I'm just folding the flap that's already on the die cut. Make sure that it is scored really well, and that way I know how low I can glue my trees. I'm putting a piece of score tape on it for later, for when we put our card together. This is just pre-doing it while the pieces aren't together to make it a little bit easier. I'm going to glue the white piece down just as it was die cut. Make sure to only put glue on the bottom parts that are actually going to touch the cardstock hill pieces. There's no need to put glue on the top because there's nothing to glue it to. Now, rather than having two identical die cuts glued on the same layer, I'm going to cut the green piece apart and shift the pieces a little bit just to make sure that tree line looks varied and so that it's not a repeat pattern. Once that's glued down, you can set it aside for when we're putting our card together. You could also put stickles on the trees if you want. I chose not to just because I don't think it would be seen very well. Next, I'm using this die set for the hills. I'm only using the 3 back pieces of the hills. I don't necessarily like the way the trees are on this die cut. In this particular project, I think it would look silly having 2 different style trees in it, so I'm choosing not to. So I've got my dies on top of the corresponding piece of cardstock, and I'm just going to glue them together. Once it's glued together, I'm going to add a little bit of stickles on the top of the snow just for a little bit of sparkle. I also add a little bit of Glossy Accents to the river to make it look a little bit more realistic and set that aside to dry. So now I'm going to use my other small hill and I'm going to do the front piece. I've die cut a set of trees out of a dark green, and I've also die cut some figures for the front as well. I'm going to cut those trees apart and separate them a bit, once again so that it's not a repeat pattern of the tree layer behind it. I'm adding a small piece of gold vellum behind the lantern piece just to make it look like it's got light shining in it. In order to cut the right amount, I'm just taking a pencil and marking where the outsides of my die cut are, and then I will cut my vellum slightly smaller than that and glue it on the inside. Next, I'm going to put together the wreath that goes on top of that, or hangs from that lamppost. I've got a little green wreath die cut, and I've got a piece of gold cut into a bow that is going to go on it. And then I'm just going to use some red Stickles to put little cranberries on the wreath. I'm also gluing my lamppost right onto my small hill base, and I'm going to highlight some areas of it with a gold gel pen. You may notice the gentleman die cut that I have looks a little bit different than the die cover. I just cut his front leg off to make him look like he was standing a little bit more upright. I thought it was a bit more appropriate for this scene. I'm gluing those figures to the small hill base, and then I'm going to use a mixture of Stickles and gel pen to just highlight and bring out some features of those die cuts. So I'm just adding the score tape to the bottom of that hill flap so that it's ready for when we're putting our card together. Once I'm done applying the Stickles to this piece, I'm going to set it aside so that it can dry completely before assembling the card. In order to have a different colored background for this card, I chose to cut an extra piece of cardstock. I'm just marking where the edges of my mountains will sit, so then I can ink the background to make it look kind of like a sunrise sky. In the card base die set, there's also a die cut of a Santa and a sleigh. You could add that to the sky as well. In this particular project, I chose not to, just because there's not much of the sky that's actually visible, so I thought that detail would get lost. But it is a cute detail to add if you choose. Because there's some space between each of the layers in this card, I did choose to ink this entire piece of cardstock so that if you saw behind the mountains a little bit, it was inked and not white. I just thought it looked a little bit more finished that way. Now that that inked background is done, we're ready to put our card together. The first step, I'm going to glue that inked piece to the back of my card, and then I'm going to glue one of the top and bottom pieces. I'm going to glue one to the bottom to create the base of my card.
Edges here. You can cut your full width of your card. The bottom and the top bit,
when you die cut the base, it already has the flaps on it, and there's a score line. So I'm just folding along that score line, and I'm going to crease it really, really well with my bone folder before attempting to glue it to the card base. If you try to glue it first and then score later, sometimes it can get a little bit awkward and not as precise. Once those flaps are scored, you can put the score tape on it. I'm going to attach one of the edges to the back of my card, and I'm going to leave the front off for now while we're adding our elements to our card.
Make sure to push your tape on and make sure it's got some good contact with your paper first. And then I'm actually going to turn this over to glue it together. This way I can see the folded edge and I can see exactly where the edges of my card are, and I can put it all down at once. It's a little bit harder to see that from this side, so much easier to do that all at once and have it done.
Now that the bottom is on the back, I'm going to add the first layer. So the first layer is our mountain layer. I have a piece of cardstock here that's 1 inch wide and the length of the mountains. I'm going to use that to create a flap on the bottom because these dies don't come with a flap already, and I don't want to lose some of the height of my mountains by scoring that bottom. So just a scrap piece of cardstock will work for this. I'm going to add some score tape, and then I'm going to attach it to the bottom of the card
and then I scored
base.
it in half at a ½ inch. And for this I use wider tape. It's not quite a ½ inch. I want to say it's about 3/8 of an inch. In Canada, I believe it's 9mm, this one here. So I'm going to put my flap on the back of the mountains. Press that down before I actually glue
Before I
that
attach
down.
the mountains to
My
the base,
hill
I want
part
to take
is
my hill
actually a
piece and
little
cut it
bit- the
shorter.
die makes it
This
a little
particular
bit
die
bigger
cut is longer than the
than
other
so I'm
one,
just
so
gonna
I
cut
want to
that
make sure
down
that it's the same width and
so
not
they're
have
the
all
same
different
width.
widths with my layers.
The hills with the trees and with the people are a little bit wider than that, but I don't mind that, but I just don't want everything to be a different width here. So this is a 1/2 inch here. I'm gonna leave it at that. This whole bottom is 2 inches. So these, the flaps for all the rest of them are a 1/2 inch. I'm just gonna cut them down a little bit because I don't want this front edge
Because
to be
that
right
mountain
at the
piece
front
is
of the
quite
card. I want
heavy,
it to be
it
back
tends
a
to
little
flop
bit.
a little bit forward, so I just added a bit
But
of
I'm gonna
extra
keep the
support
back
behind
one
it
the
by
same
using
width,
another
and the
piece of
reason
scrap
is
paper shorter than the mountains,
these mountains
and
are
it's
a
an
little
inch
bit
high
heavy,
and
so they
a 1/2
tend to
inch
fall a
wide,
little
so
bit
the same
forward.
width
So I'm
as
gonna create a
the
brace
tab that I created for the bottom,
to help to
and
brace
it's
them
going to
up.
glue to
So
the
this
back
piece
of the
here
card
is
base
for-
and
it's
just
an
support
inch
the
up,
weight of
and then
those
there's a
mountains so
1/2
they don't
inch
flop
gap
forward.
there, which is the same as the flap on the bottom here. So I've got these measurements on your supply list, so you don't have to remember this. But basically I took it, I scored it at 1 inch and 1.5 inches. And what this is gonna do, it's just gonna give a little bit of support for those mountains there. There we go. All right, now next one is our tree layer.
Now we can
And
add
cut
each
this
one of the
a
other
little bit
layers to the
farther
card
down.
base. Now the card base is 2 inches wide, and the flaps that are on these pieces
already have the
are a
tape
1/2
on
inch
there.
wide. So if I use the
Just take
flaps
the
as they
backing
were,
off.
the front piece of the
And
card
I'm
with the
just
people on it would be
eyeballing it to
even
make
with
it
the front of the
as
card,
even
and
a
I wanted
layer
it to
as
stick a little
possible.
bit back. So you might have noticed me cutting a little bit
It's a
off
little
the
bit
flap,
angled.
making
It's
it a
not gonna
little
matter
bit
too
narrower,
much.
and that way there's going to be some space between the front of the card and that
Ended
first
up
layer
having to
with
go-
the
or
people and
ended
the
up putting
lantern
a
on
little
it.
bit too far over, so I'm just gonna snip that off.
So I'll be doing this with all the other flaps so that they're a little bit narrower than
Put
the
flap
1/2 inch.
on our hills. And you can see this tape, you can just rip it. You don't have to cut it every single time, which ends up saving you time basically. It's nice to not have to take out your scissors every single time to cut it down. And put it on our piece. And I always like to trim them down afterwards. So this is 4 1/4, but the hills are just slightly narrower. The mountains were just slightly narrower. And then I'm also gonna make that narrower than a 1/2 inch. And if when cutting it, I happen to cut it a little bit crooked, I don't sweat it too much. We're putting white cardstock on a white background, so it's not very visible. Let's fold this one first before we cut it down. Now, when you're putting this card up and down, these trees and all these angles like to kind of stick to or catch on the other layers. And I had that with the card pieces, the ones that actually came in there with the houses and stuff like that. I had that as well. And what I found the best solution for that,
So as I
to
said
simply-
earlier, I cut
you
little
probably
pieces
saw it
of
at the
vellum
beginning,
to
put
go in
pieces of
between my
acetate.
die
When I'm
cuts
sending them to
for when
people,
my
put
card
pieces
lays
of
flat.
acetate
This just
between
helps those
pieces
die
so
cuts
that they
not
don't
catch on
catch.
each other when you're folding
And
it
that
flat to
helps
put it into an
it
envelope.
move a little bit,
And it's nice because it's
easier.
clear,
And
so
then
it
the
doesn't
other thing,
interfere
too,
with the initial
is they
reaction
slide
or the
out
initial
super
look
easy.
of the
They're
card,
clear, so it's
but
not
it just
gonna,
helps
impede
with
the
frustration
initial
while you're folding it
look or
down.
reaction to the card, but it is going to help those pieces pop up a little bit easier and not
Now that our
catch on
card
each
base
other.
is done, we're ready to start folding and scoring the flaps to the top piece. So I'm just making sure to fold them and score them before attaching them to the front of my card.
And because we use nice heavy cardstock with this, sometimes it's a little bit harder to get a really good straight crease on this. but you want it to be as straight as possible, otherwise it doesn't flatten out as nice. There we go. And when I'm gluing, using Sukwang to glue pieces of cardstock,
once that's done, I'll just set it aside, and I'm going to attach the front of my card to that card base that's already on, attached to the back.
So now I'm going to take this bottom part backing off, because I can see my fold right there. And I want to make sure that it's as straight as possible before pushing it down. There we go, and I like to push it both ways, but you see how like the lamp just stuck on the
now I'll attach that top part to the front of the card. I'm lining up my edge of the top with the straight line that's under the intricate die cuts for the top, trying to keep it as straight as possible.
Lining it up with the straight edge from here, making sure my edges are lined up with the sides of the card. And then for this last
once the top is glued to the front, the best way to get
make sure that it is 100% lined up
the whole card glued together properly is to fold the card base down flat the way that you're seeing me do it now, and then making sure that that score line is really, really good, taking part of the backing of the tape off and securing it a little bit at a time, holding it in place while I'm peeling that backing off so that nothing shifts.
And then pull this so that nothing has moved. So there we go. So the last step, and I've already cut, oh, it's right here. I've already cut the pieces for it. In that Shadowbox die set is the banner and the Merry Christmas. So all I'm gonna do is put a little bit of glue.
Because the front tended to look a little bit plain, I chose to add the banner and Merry Christmas to the front. These are pieces that are in the Shadow Base card die set. They're included with it, so it's not an extra die set.
So, and I didn't put any glue for this opening here. So then once that's completely done and everything's dried, you can put your acetate in there, flatten it, and put it in your card. But there we go.
And this is how the card looks. So and now that our base or our card is ready, we can make a custom envelope for it. So this card fits into an A9 envelope.
You may be able to
which
find
has a finished size of 5 3/4 by 8 3/4
You're
inches.
probably not going to make it for a ton of people, so why not customize your card? So the sample one I just did in white. This one I'm going to do
I have a piece of 12 by 12 red cardstock here to make the envelope out of, and I'm going to cut it down to 9 3/4 inches wide and keep the 12-inch
to 9 3/4. And then take up my scoreboard. First thing I do
along the 9 3/4 or the shorter side, I'm going to cut, or I'm going to score a half an inch down the 12-inch length of the piece.
Score line there. So do that to both sides. And I'll have a diagram and the measurements that you'll need for this in your supply list. But if you need
along
to
the
refer to
12-inch
this,
side
I
of the
will say
cardstock,
measurements
you
well.
need to
So the
score
first
at
score
4
line
inches
is going
and
to be at
9
the 4-inch
3/4
mark.
inches. Now I have a scoreboard that doesn't
This I do
have
twice
1/4
as well.
inch
The next one needs
increments
to
in
be
my
at the 9
score lines,
3/4, but
so you
because
do
there's no
need to
mark
shift
there,
it up a little bit to get
way
the
to do
proper
it
score
is
line in there.
Get your cardstock, put it up about 1/4 of an inch, and then do the score line at 10 inches. And again, I like to do that twice as well. So now we've got our pieces in there. Now,
once those score lines are scored, you're going to cut out the corners.
And this way, if you
I'm
only have
using
1 or 2 to
my
make,
slide rule trimmer, and I'm going to cut from
so
the
along that
half-inch
half-inch
score
side, that
mark,
12-inch
just down to that first score line, and from the bottom up to the
out.
score line, so that I have 2 flaps on the side to put our envelope together. Using this type of trimmer makes it very, very easy because you can see exactly where the blade ends. You could also use scissors.
Same for the other side. And these little arrows on the side of the blade make it really, really easy to see exactly where the blade is cutting to. So you don't have to guess. This 1/2 inch part here, I'm just going to cut it with the scissors. You could use the trimmer to do that as well, but it's just as easy to just snip it with scissors. And those bits,
so this is what your piece should look like before you glue anything together. Now I like to round those corners because I think it looks better. So I'm going to take a corner rounder and I'm going to remove the guard from it and just round all of the corners, including the flaps, just to make it look a little bit nicer.
Have it in the corner rounder and not too far. And if you had a fancy corner rounder that did a little bit more of a fancy corner, you could absolutely use that as well. You can see I have some fluffy edges on here, and it's because my blade to my trimmer isn't super sharp. I need a new blade, but my local store is not open today, so I didn't want to wait to do this until it was open. So, all right, now we're going to fold those flaps in. I'm going to use my bone folder. I've got a flat side on it that I like to use to really get a good crease on that flap. And then same with the bottom part. Now, instead of putting the tape on the sides here, it's hard to tell unless
I fold
you put a mark
everything
exactly
before
where that
gluing
ends.
it together.
Easiest
And then
way
I'm going to
without
take
having
my
to mark
score tape.
anything.
I'm actually going to put it on that longer flap to the
tape
right
on
rather
this
than the
side.
flap in the center, just so that then I
guesswork,
know
you
exactly when
where
to
that paper
end the
ends.
tape rather than trying to guess by putting it on the flap in the center. I'm going to do that down both sides to glue the bottom of my envelope to the flaps.
And if you wanted, you could put a little bit of printed Christmas paper or something in there. I don't bother.
Now all that's left is folding the bottom and inserting
you
your
absolutely
card into
could.
your envelope and
It's a
sending
good
it
way
to
to
your
use some
recipient.
scraps. If you happen to have a blade that's not super sharp and you need to trim, just trim it with scissors. And then you have an envelope that you can fit your card in. I do need to cut my acetate pieces.
So it may look here like I'm
shorter.
struggling here, but I actually have my acetate pieces in the card and I haven't cut them down, so I need to cut them down before closing my envelope back up. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed watching this and learning this, and it's inspired you to send some cards out to some special people.
And make it
Have a great
little
day.
bit more special.